On the afternoon of September 14th, 2021, two F-22 Raptors were scrambled with orders to intercept and, if necessary, destroy a civilian aircraft carrying 180 people. What stopped them was a 14-year-old girl, and two words her father had taught her in a garage in Texas. This is not a rescue story. This is a story about what a father leaves behind and whether it's ever enough. The leather jacket had been at the bottom of the backpack since Phoenix. Mia Caldwell didn't take it out at the airport. She never did in public. It was folded the same way every time, collar inward, sleeves crossed over the chest like something sleeping. The leather was dark brown, cracked at the elbows, and smelled faintly of engine oil and a cologne that no store sold anymore. She had searched. She had gone to 3 different department stores in Scottsdale the previous spring, holding up bottles and spraying them on her wrist one after another, trying to find the one. She never did. Inside the collar, her mother had sewn the name in block letters before the funeral. Black thread on black leather. You had to know it was there to find it. Ghost. And below that, smaller in her father's own handwriting, transferred by a seamstress from a piece of paper Mia had found folded in his desk drawer, for when the sky calls your name. She didn't know what he meant by that when she first read it. She was 12 years old and her father had been dead for 3 weeks, and the words felt like something from a movie. Something a character says before the screen goes dark and the credits roll, and you drive home and forget it by morning. She was 14 now. She still didn't know what he meant, but she kept the jacket close. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport on a September afternoon is a specific kind of brutal. The heat comes off the tarmac in visible waves, the kind that makes the air look like it's breathing. Inside the terminal hums with the particular low-grade anxiety of people who are always slightly late, slightly lost, slightly convinced they've forgotten something important. Mia moved through it the way she moved through most things, quietly, efficiently, and without asking for help. She was small for 14. She knew this. Adults were always surprised by her age, which she had long since stopped finding flattering. She wore jeans worn at the knees and a gray t-shirt with the name of a high school she didn't attend. Her hair was pulled back in a braid that had been neat at 6 in the morning and was less so by noon. Her backpack was old and slightly too big for her frame, and she carried it with the practiced lean of someone who had learned to compensate for its weight. She had been flying alone since she was 12. Her aunt lived in Washington, D.C., 3 hours in a time zone away. Every September, Mia made the trip. It had started as something her mother arranged a reason to get her out of the house during the anniversary week, the hardest week, the week when every corner of their small Scottsdale house felt like it was holding its breath. By now, it was simply something Mia did, a fixed point on the calendar, a thing that was hers. At the gate, a young woman in a blue vest approached her with a clipboard and a practiced smile. "Are you traveling alone today, sweetheart? We can have someone walk you to—" "I'm fine," Mia said, politely, firmly. "Thank you." The woman hesitated, glancing at the backpack, at the boarding pass in Mia's hand, at the stillness in her face that people always seem to find unsettling in a child her age. "Of course," the woman said and stepped aside. Mia found a seat near the window and opened her sketchbook. She drew what she always drew: planes. An F-16 first, she could do those from memory in under 2 minutes, then the longer, more careful lines of an F-22 Raptor. The Raptor was harder. The geometry was unforgiving. The fuselage had to taper precisely or the whole thing looked wrong, like a word misspelled by a single letter. Her father had told her that the F-22 was designed to be invisible to radar, that it absorbed signals instead of reflecting them, that it could be standing 50 feet away and the instruments would tell you the sky was empty. She thought about that sometimes, about things that were present but undetected. She shaded the intake vents and looked up at the runway. A 737 was taxiing toward the far end, moving with the slow, deliberate authority of something that knew exactly how heavy it was. She watched it line up, watched the engines build, watched the moment, the very specific moment, the one that always got her, when the wheels left the ground and the aircraft became something other than what it had been a second before. Her father had once described it as a bird remembering how to fly. "Nice crosswind today, Dad," she said under her breath. It was something she had started doing without deciding to, a habit that had crept in somewhere in the first year after his death and never left. She talked to him about flying things, weather and wind and altitude and the angle of approach. The technical language felt safer than the other kind, less likely to split open. She closed her sketchbook when they called the boarding group. Flight 317, gate C22, seat 7A. The interior of the plane smelled the way all planes smelled: recycled air and lemon cleaner, and the faint ghost of someone's coffee from the previous flight. Mia found her row without looking at the seat numbers. She had the window. She always took the window. She stowed the backpack under the seat in front of her instead of the overhead bin. She always did this too. She wanted it where she could reach it. She pressed the toe of her sneaker against it once lightly just to confirm. The jacket was there, right where it should be. She pressed her forehead against the oval window and watched the ground crew. A man in orange earmuffs was guiding a luggage cart moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done the same task 10,000 times. Another was checking the wheel well, crouching low, running a hand along the undercarriage with the attention of someone who understood that the small things mattered most. Her father had told her that. Small things. The ones that get skipped when you're in a hurry. The ones that nobody notices until they do. The seat beside her 7B was taken by a man who settled in without ceremony. He was somewhere in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had spent significant time outdoors and showed it. He wore a plain navy jacket over a plain white shirt. He carried no laptop, no book, no magazine. He sat down, buckled his seatbelt, and turned to look out the window with a stillness that struck Mia as slightly unusual. Most people, when they sat down on a plane, immediately began doing something. Checking their phone, arranging their belongings, eating something they'd bought at the gate. This man had just looked out the window, calm, attentive. His eyes tracked the ground crew the same way hers did. She glanced at him once. He didn't glance back. She turned back to her own window. The flight to Washington was 3 hours and 12 minutes on a good day. Mia knew this the way she knew a lot of things, not from looking it up, but from repetition. She had done this route enough times that her body understood it on its own terms. The climb, the long cruise at altitude, the gradual descent, the way the light changed over the mid-Atlantic states in the late afternoon. They lifted off at 1:48 p.m. She felt the familiar surge, the engines building to a pitch that she felt in her sternum more than heard, and then the ground dropping away beneath her and the city of Phoenix spreading out into the desert like something spilled. The wheels retracted with a thud that she always found reassuring, which she knew was irrational. The thud meant the mechanism had engaged. The absence of the thud would have been the problem, but the sound was solid, definite. It meant the plane had committed. She thought about her father at moments like this, not in a way she could always explain, not a specific memory, not a full image, more like a frequency, a register she could only hear at altitude when the ground had let go and the noise of the ordinary world dropped away. He had described flying as stepping into a different world. Up there, the rules change, he had told her. The ground doesn't own you anymore. She understood that better now than she had at 9. The seatbelt sign went off with a soft chime. Mia opened her sketchbook again and let the hour pass. The garage had been her father's kingdom. Not a fancy garage. A 2-car garage in a subdivision in Scottsdale with fluorescent lights and a concrete floor and a workbench along the back wall that was always more organized than anywhere else in the house. He had built the flight simulator set up himself. 2 monitors, a joystick, a throttle quadrant, rudder pedals on the floor. The chair was an old office chair with a bungee cord holding one of the armrests in place. He had promised to fix it for 2 years. He never did. Mia had been 9 the first time he put the headset on her. It was enormous. The ear cups covered half her face. She had to hold it in place with both hands or it slid sideways. Her father sat beside her patient in the way he was always patient about things that mattered and fed her the words one at a time. Say it back, he told her. Flight 317, Phoenix approach level, 10,000, heading 270. Again. She said it again. Again, but this time don't rush the numbers. She said it a third time, slowing down on the digits the way he'd shown her, letting each one land separately. 317, not 317, not a number. 3 pieces of information. Better, he said. He adjusted her headset with one hand, tipped it slightly so it sat more level. Do you know why I'm teaching you this? She had shrugged. She was 9. She thought it was a game. Because communication is the difference, he said, between a problem that gets solved and a problem that kills you. Up there, he nodded upward, a gesture that meant not the ceiling but the sky beyond it. You don't have time to be imprecise. You don't have time to be unclear. The right words at the right moment. That's not just radio etiquette. That's the thing that keeps people alive. He let that sit for a moment. Then he bumped her shoulder gently with his and grinned. Also, it's pretty cool. She had laughed. He had laughed with her. The bungee cord on the armrest swung slightly in the draft from the door. That was the night he gave her the name. She had asked him what his call sign meant. Why Falcon? He considered this seriously the way he considered things she asked him that he thought deserved a serious answer. A falcon doesn't wait for permission, he said. It sees it, decides, it moves. No hesitation, no second guessing. It's committed the moment it leaves the branch, he paused. And once it's locked on to something, nothing shakes it loose. She thought about this. What's mine? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. The fluorescent light hummed above them. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the dark. Little Hawk, he said. Why Hawk? Because hawks don't wait to be told when to fly. He tapped the ear cup of her headset lightly, like a salute. Again, he said, from the top. An hour and 40 minutes into the flight, the man in 7B made a small sound. It was not dramatic, not the kind of sound that clears a room. It was quiet and brief, the kind of thing that under almost any other circumstances Mia would not have registered. But she was not asleep, and she was not wearing earbuds, and the sound was close enough to her elbow that she felt it as much as heard it. She looked over. The man's face had changed. He was still upright in his seat, still belted, but something had shifted beneath his expression. A tightening, a graying around the mouth. His right hand was pressed flat against his chest, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the quiet deliberateness of someone trying to hold something in place. His eyes met hers. For a moment he said nothing, then quietly, almost apologetically, "Get the flight attendant." Mia was already pressing the call button before the sentence was finished. What happened next was fast, but controlled the way things are when trained people encounter a situation they have trained for. Diane Marsh was at the row within 30 seconds. She moved through a cabin like she owned it, unhurried but absolute. She took one look at the man and her expression did not change, which Mia recognized as the professional version of changing completely. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" "Devlin," he said. "Russ Devlin." "Okay, Mr. Devlin, I need you to stay with me." She signaled to her colleague at the far end of the cart with a gesture small enough that most passengers wouldn't catch it. Her colleague caught it immediately. The cart moved. A space was cleared. What Mia noticed, and she noticed it because she was watching the way she always watched, seeing the whole situation, not just the part in front of her, was the way Diane spoke into the interphone handset at the forward galley. Low, specific. The call lasted less than 20 seconds. When she came back, her posture was slightly different. Not worse, just different. The way a person's posture changes when they have added something new to the list of things they are managing. Mia did not know who Russ Devlin was. She did not know that he carried credentials and training that no one else in the cabin possessed, that his boarding had been noted in a system that flagged his seat number and his status as a standing precaution against exactly the kind of situation that was now beginning invisibly to develop. She knew only that something about the way Diane handled that call felt different from the way you handled a passenger with a bad headache. She reached for her sketchbook. Her hands needed something to do. In a room that appears on no public map inside a building in Colorado that most people have never heard of, a young woman named Bridget Farrow was staring at a frequency analysis display that was telling her something she did not want to see. Bridget was 26 years old and had been working at the NORAD Cheyenne Mountain Complex for 14 months. She was methodical and careful, the kind of analyst whose supervisors described her as an asset in their internal evaluations. She found irregularities in data the way some people find typos, not by looking hard, but by looking at everything equally, which meant the wrong things stood out on their own. The irregularity she was looking at now was not subtle. A frequency test had been running out of Langley Air Force Base since approximately 1600 hours. A classified trial of a new communications suppression technology, experimental in the early evaluation phase. Bridget had not been briefed on it. Very few people had. What the display was showing her now was that the test signal radius was larger than the parameters indicated, significantly larger. Large enough that it had blanketed a corridor of airspace over the mid-Atlantic approach to Washington, the same corridor that Flight 317 civilian passenger aircraft was currently transiting. The consequences were not complicated. Flight 317's radio systems would be experiencing total disruption. Primary comms, backups, possibly transponder interference on certain frequencies. The pilots would not be able to raise the tower. They would not be able to explain why. They would be flying in silence, not because anything was wrong with their aircraft, but because a frequency test that was never supposed to reach them had reached them. Bridget pulled up the flight data, cross-referenced the signal radius, ran the calculation twice. Then she picked up her direct line and asked to speak to General Harlan Webb. Webb came to the phone in 40 seconds. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, carrying the particular authority of someone who had learned that the most powerful thing in a room was often the quietest voice in it. He had known James Caldwell Ghost briefly in the way Air Force careers created brief intersections between trajectories that otherwise ran parallel. He remembered him as precise, reliable, and slightly uncategorizable. The kind of officer you were glad was on your side without always being able to say exactly why. He listened to Bridget's report without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence of approximately 5 seconds. "You're certain," he said. "Yes, sir." "Classify the technical report. Send it to my terminal only. Don't discuss this with anyone on your floor until you hear from me." "Sir, the aircraft is—" "I understand what the aircraft is doing, Specialist. I'll handle it from here." He hung up. Bridget held the phone for a moment after the line went dead. Then she opened a second window on her terminal and began writing a report of her own. She wrote the time at the top. She wrote everything she had found and everything she had been told and everything she had been told to do with what she had found. She did not send it anywhere. She saved it. Time-stamped. Her own record for when the record mattered. In the cockpit of Flight 317, Captain Marcus Brandt had been trying to raise Phoenix approach for 11 minutes. He was not a man given to panic. 22 years of commercial aviation had installed in him a form of professional calm that was not the absence of concern, but the presence of method. When things went wrong and things went wrong, this was the first thing you learned and the last thing you forgot. You worked the problem. You identified, you isolated, you addressed. He was working the problem. "Try guard frequency," he said to Hollins. First Officer Garrett Hollins, 7 years his junior, equally competent, managing the kind of focused expression that Brandt recognized as his own face in the early years, adjusted the radio and spoke into the headset. Nothing. They tried 4 frequencies in sequence. Primary, secondary, emergency, guard. Each one returned the same response, which was not static. Exactly. Static implied some signal was present. This was something closer to silence. A clean, absolute absence of anything coming back. "Transponder," Brandt asked. "Squawking normally, mode C active. We're visible on radar." "So they can see us." "They can see us. They just can't hear us." "Correct." Brandt sat with this. The autopilot held them steady at flight level 310. The instruments were normal. The aircraft was performing exactly as it should. The sky outside was clear and deep and entirely indifferent. "Run the avionics diagnostic," he said. The results came back inconclusive in a way that was itself a kind of answer. The systems were not detecting a fault because the fault was not inside the aircraft. Whatever was interfering with their communications was coming from somewhere outside. Brandt picked up the interphone and called the forward galley. Diane answered on the second ring. He told her in the language that flight crews use among themselves, precise, stripped of anything that could cause alarm if overheard, that they were experiencing a communications disruption and that she should maintain normal cabin operations. She told him they had a passenger with a possible cardiac event in row 7, currently stable. She was monitoring. He thanked her and hung up. He looked at Hollins. Hollins looked at him. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that they were 40 minutes from the most restricted airspace in the country, that they could not explain themselves to anyone watching, and that in certain protocols both of them knew existed but had never expected to find personally relevant, a civilian aircraft that could not be reached by any means was categorized differently from a civilian aircraft that was simply late to respond. Brandt kept his hands on the yoke. He kept flying. Mia felt the change before she understood it. Not in the sound, not in the motion of the aircraft. In the atmosphere. The specific quality of air in an enclosed space when the people who know what's happening have stopped being able to fully hide that something is happening. She had grown up around pilots. She knew what controlled composure looked like from the inside because she had watched her father practice it, the deliberate steadiness, the carefully measured voice, the eyes that stayed calm while the hands worked. The code that meant I have the situation, but the situation is real. Diane was working that code now. She moved through the cabin with the same efficiency as before, answering questions with the same warm competence. But her attention had shifted in frequency. She was checking the forward galley more often. She was making brief eye contact with her colleague at the aft end in a way that looked casual and wasn't. The intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Hollins. We're currently experiencing some minor interference with our communication systems. Nothing to be concerned about. We have full control of the aircraft and we're proceeding normally toward Washington Dulles. We ask that you keep your seatbelts fastened as a precaution. We appreciate your patience." The cabin absorbed this in the way people absorb information they are not fully prepared to evaluate. A murmur ran through the rows. The businessman 3 seats back stopped, typing. A woman near the window repeated the word interference to her companion with a tone that made the word larger than it was. Mia said nothing. Her father had told her once that the careful announcements were the ones to pay attention to. That a pilot who was relaxed said very little. That a pilot who said everything was fine, and here is why, and please keep your seatbelt fastened, was managing something beneath the surface of the words. She opened her sketchbook, tried to draw, put her pencil down, and then she heard it, not with her ears first, with her chest. A vibration lower than the engines coming from outside the fuselage rather than inside. She pressed her forehead against the window. The sky was clear and impossibly blue, and the sun was angling toward the western horizon in a long golden slide. And there off the left wingtip moving with a speed and precision that made the commercial airliner feel suddenly very large and very slow was a shape she knew. Slender, angled, twin tails, diamond-cut wings. F-22 Raptor. She had drawn it 100 times. She had never seen one move. It was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure, the way certain things are when they step out of the imagination and into the world, when they stop being representations of themselves and become themselves fully and irrevocably. The jet held its position off the wing with a stillness that seemed impossible at that speed, adjusting its angle with tiny invisible corrections that spoke of a pilot in complete control. She looked to the right side. There was another one. Two of them, one on each wing, flying in formation with a civilian aircraft over the eastern seaboard, which was not something that happened by coincidence and was not something that happened for ordinary reasons. She knew this without having to work it out. She sat very still in seat 7A, and she breathed slowly, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her. Something is wrong. And then with a clarity that surprised her even more, I know what these are. I know what they do. I know why they're here. The passengers saw the jets before the crew could manage the moment. It started on the left side rows 12 through 20, where a teenage boy pressed his face against the oval window and said nothing for 3 full seconds before grabbing his mother's arm. Then a woman in row 15. Then the businessman who had stopped typing and had been sitting with his hands folded on his tray table like a man waiting for a verdict. Then all of it at once, heads turning necks, craning a wave of recognition, moving through the cabin, faster than information, deeper than logic. Fighter jets, 2 of them, one off each wing. The sound changed in the cabin the way sound changes in a room when everyone stops talking at exactly the same moment. Not silence exactly. Something denser than that. A child in row 9 said loudly and with genuine delight, "Those are fighter jets." Her father said nothing. Mia was already watching from 7A, and she had not reached for her phone like the 6 people around her who were now holding their cameras to the glass. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she thought about what she knew. The F-22 Raptor had a combat radius of approximately 500 miles. It could reach Mach 1.8 in afterburner. It was designed for air superiority, a phrase that sounded abstract until you understood what it meant in practice, which was the ability to remove other aircraft from the sky. When 2 of them appeared alongside a civilian aircraft without announcement or explanation, they were not there for an air show. The intercom clicked on. Diane's voice controlled and warm in the way that took significant effort to maintain. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We ask that you keep the aisle clear at this time." The murmur in the cabin climbed in register. The woman who had said interference was now saying something else entirely, her voice pitched lower tighter. The businessman had opened his laptop again, not to work, but to have something to look at that wasn't the jet out the window. In the cockpit, Brant heard the same transmission that was now feeding through the cabin speakers the military had broadcast on an open frequency wide enough that the cabin audio system had picked it up. "Flight 317, this is United States Air Force Interceptor Viper. You are approaching restricted airspace. Acknowledge on this frequency. Flight 317, respond immediately." The cabin became extremely still. Someone in row 11 whispered, "They're talking to us." While a woman in row 14 said to no one, "Why isn't anyone answering?" In the cockpit, Hollins was already on the radio pressing the transmit key. Nothing went out. The system took the input and produced no output, like speaking into a room where the sound stopped at the door. Brant released the key, pressed it again, released it. Outside, the F-22 off the right wing dipped slightly, a controlled adjustment, small and deliberate, then returned to level. A signal, not aggressive. Something more like, "We see you, we are here, we need you to respond." Brant picked up the interphone and called Diane. She answered in one ring. He told her about the auxiliary forward communications panel, the one that existed for emergencies predating the current systems, the one that required a working knowledge of radio procedure that went beyond standard cabin crew certification. He asked if anyone on the aircraft could use it. She said she didn't know. He told her to find out. Diane hung up and looked at the cabin. She did it slowly, methodically, reading the room not for faces but for types, searching for the traveler who had been somewhere before, who had been in a situation before, whose body was already responding to this one in ways the others weren't. Her gaze moved through the rows and almost missed it. The girl in 7A had not reached for her phone, had not turned to the window with the others, had not leaned into the aisle or strained toward the glass or done any of the things that every other passenger in her vicinity was doing. She was sitting completely still. Her hands were in her lap. She was looking at the forward galley. Not with fear. Diane recognized the expression had seen. It she realized in colleagues during the two genuine emergencies of her 19-year career. Assessment. The face of someone measuring a situation against prior knowledge. Diane crossed to her, crouched slightly so her voice stayed low. "Honey, are you all right?" The girl looked at her directly, a child's face with something older operating behind it. "The panel behind the galley service cover," she said. "Is it still wired to the antenna feed?" Diane held very still. "What do you know about that panel?" "My father flew F-22s, the girl said. "He ran radio drills with me for years. I know the procedure." A pause. "I know the frequencies." Diane looked at her for 2 full seconds. Then she stood up. "Come with me." The panel was smaller than Mia had imagined it should have. She had built a version of it in her head over years of her father's descriptions, over the simulator sessions in the garage, over the hours of repetition that had worn certain phrases and sequences into her memory, the way repeated contact wears grooves into wood. In her mind, it was authoritative, a thing equal to its function. In reality, it was a gray metal box with a frequency dial, a squelch knob, a push-to-talk switch, and a small speaker fitted into a recessed panel that looked like it had been installed when the aircraft was younger than she was. She sat down in the small fold-out seat in front of it. Diane handed her the headset without saying anything. Lighter than the one in the garage. The ear cup smaller. It fit, which was something. She reached for the frequency dial. The markings were ones she recognized. She set it to guard frequency. First guard was the emergency channel, the one her father had told her to use when uncertain, because guard was where people listened when they didn't know where else to listen. She adjusted the squelch, checked the transmit switch. Live. She pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed. In the garage in Texas, with the fluorescent light humming and the bungee cord swinging from the broken armrest, her father had told her something she had not fully understood at the time and had carried without understanding for years, the way you carry things before you're ready for them. He had said the radio is just a voice, and a voice is just a person. When you key that mic, you're not talking to a system or a frequency or a protocol. You're talking to a person on the other end who is doing their job in a difficult situation and needs to understand you clearly. That's the whole thing. Clarity, presence, trust. She closed her eyes. She heard him. Not his memory exactly, something more present than that, the register of his voice, the cadence of it, the way he said her name. Not Mia. In those moments, always Little Hawk. The name that meant, I see exactly who you are, and I'm telling you what I see. She opened her eyes. She pressed the transmit key. Flight 317 to interceptor. Her voice cracked on the second word. She stopped, breathed, started again, and this time the words came out differently. Slower level, carried on a breath that reached all the way down. Flight 317 to interceptor. This is Little Hawk. Cockpit has lost all communications. 180 passengers aboard. We are not hostile. Please don't fire. She released the key. The speaker hissed. 8 seconds of nothing. Then a voice came through that was not what she had expected, which was pure command and military efficiency. What came through was something that had all of those things in it and something else, something that sounded in the fraction of a second before she understood it, like a man who had just heard something he had not known he was waiting to hear. Say again, Flight 317. Did you just identify as Little Hawk? She pressed the key. Affirmative. This is Little Hawk. Total communications failure in the cockpit. Passengers are safe. Pilots are in control. Please don't fire. Another silence. Shorter this time. Then a second voice entered the channel. Different in texture, lower in register, a woman's voice carrying something that professional layers did not entirely conceal. Viper, I know that call sign. A pause. Ghost only ever used it for one person. In the cockpit of the lead F-22, Major Derek Voss was not a man who lost composure in the air. He had 2,341 hours in the F-22. He had flown intercepts over the Gulf of Mexico and the North Atlantic. He had been scrambled for threats that turned out to be nothing, and for alerts that turned out to be something, and for everything in between. He had on 3 separate occasions been in the air with live weapons in a situation that required decisions in seconds that would be analyzed for months. He did not lose composure in the air. He was losing it now. He recognized this with the part of his mind that was still running the professional checklist while the rest of him did something else entirely. Little Hawk, he knew that name the way he knew the sound of his own heartbeat. Not because it appeared in any debrief or file or record, but because James Caldwell had mentioned it once in the week before the accident. They had been doing a post-flight debrief together, just the two of them, and Ghost had said something about his daughter, a radio drill they had done over the weekend, how she had the ear for it, the precision, the instinct. And he had laughed and said she called herself Little Hawk. Voss had filed it the way you file the small details of people you work with, the ones that make them specific, that separate them from the aggregate of colleagues into something individual and real. He had never expected to hear it come back through an emergency channel at 31,000 feet. He adjusted his position off the left wing, kept the formation, kept his hand steady. He opened his channel. Little Hawk, this is Interceptor Viper. Confirm your identity. Who was your father? The pause before her answer lasted long enough that he counted it. Then Colonel James Caldwell, call sign Ghost. He flew F-22s out of Langley. He died in September 2019. Voss closed his eyes for one fraction of a second. One fraction. The aircraft did not notice. When he opened them, the horizon was exactly where it should be, and the airliner was exactly where it should be, and Petra Dunn was off his right wing at the correct interval, and everything was exactly where it should be, except for the thing that was not, which was the fact that Ghost's daughter was in a passenger aircraft at altitude, and she had just spoken 2 words over an emergency channel that she could only know if her father had given them to her. He keyed the channel again. Mia? He had not planned to use her name. It came without planning. My name is Derek Voss. Your father saved my life in the fall of 2019. I was pulling into the wrong approach vector during a live fire drill, an angle error I had made before that I had been corrected on, that I made again because I was tired and pushed through when I should have called it. Your father saw it before his instruments confirmed it. He moved his aircraft into the path to push me clear. He took the impact. A pause. I walked away. He didn't. The speaker returned nothing for several seconds. Voss kept the formation. I have thought about how to find you every day for 2 years. I didn't know how. I didn't know what I would even say. His voice stayed level with the effort of someone who has had a long time to prepare and still finds the preparation insufficient. But I want you to know that everything he taught you, whatever made you pick up that radio just now, whatever made you know the right words and the right frequency and the right call sign, that was him. That was real. And I trust it completely. He released the key. He waited. In the cabin, Diane Marsh stood behind Mia with her hand on the back of the seat and did not breathe. The passengers in the forward rows had gone absolutely still. Not because they had heard the transmission, the auxiliary panel's speaker was small, and Diane had kept the volume low, but because they could see the girl at the radio, and they could see her face, and the human instinct for reading faces is very old and very reliable, and what they were reading in hers was something that stilled them, the way certain things still a room without anyone being able to say exactly why. Mia sat with her hand on the transmit key. Her eyes were fixed on the panel, but she was somewhere else. Somewhere that had a garage in it, fluorescent lights, a bungee cord swinging from a broken armrest, and a neighbor's dog barking in the dark. She breathed in, she breathed out. She pressed the key. Copy Viper. A pause, brief and certain. I trust you too. Then, without a change in tone, shifting the way her father had drilled her to shift one register to another, clean. Cockpit is manual control only. Total communications failure on their end. I can relay. Tell me what you need. In the F-22, Voss felt something he did not have a precise word for. Adjacent to relief, but not relief, because the situation had not resolved. Because 180 people were still on an aircraft that could not speak for itself. Because the decision of what happened next was above his pay grade and still being made by people in a room in Colorado who were working from protocols that did not include the variable that had just entered the equation. But something solid had appeared in the middle of a situation composed entirely of absence. Now there was a voice. He keyed his long-range channel to command frequency. Command, this is Interceptor Viper. I have direct communication with a passenger aboard Flight 317. She identifies as Mia Caldwell, daughter of Colonel James Caldwell, callsign Ghost. She used a call sign known only to her father. She has working radio procedure knowledge, and she is relaying from the cockpit. Pilots confirm manual control, no hostile intent. Request modification of engagement timeline. The response from command took 40 seconds. Viper confirmed the passenger is a minor. Confirmed, 14 years old. Silence on the command channel. Then stand by. In the operations room at NORAD, General Harlan Webb stood in front of the main display and watched three blips, one large, two small, moving in close formation across the screen. He was not an indecisive man. He had made large decisions in his career, some of which had gone well, and some of which had cost things that could not be recovered, and he had learned to live with both. The ability to make a decision and hold it was the skill that separated the effective from the ineffective at his level. He had built that skill over 34 years. He was having difficulty locating it right now. Specialist Bridget Farrow was at her station in his peripheral vision. She had said nothing since he had returned to the floor. She was looking at her screen, but he knew with the awareness of someone who has learned to read rooms that she had not stopped watching him. He had made a decision 40 minutes ago that he had told himself was operational and correct and necessary. He had classified the frequency report. He had removed from the floor the one piece of information that would have changed every subsequent calculation. He had done it because the consequences of admitting that a classified Air Force frequency test had disabled a civilian aircraft were significant and complex and would require a chain of acknowledgement that went far beyond this room and this night. He had done it, and as a result, an aircraft carrying 180 people was in his airspace, unable to communicate 30 minutes from the point of no return with two armed interceptors on its wings. Voss's voice was in his earpiece, the relay from the intercept channel. He had heard all of it, the name, the explanation, the two pilots and the girl building something in real time out of grief and trust, and the specific weight of a dead man's legacy. He had known James Caldwell, briefly, but he remembered him with the specificity of someone who left an impression, the precision, the steadiness, the quality of integrity that does not require an audience because it is not performed for one. Ghost would have told him the truth to his face. Webb pressed his hands flat on the desk in front of him. He looked at Farrow. She was already looking at him. She said nothing. She simply held his gaze steady and clear and waited. He picked up the command mic. In the forward galley, the speaker crackled. Not Voss, a different voice. Older in register, carrying something heavier, not the weight of experience, but the harder weight of a man who had been wrong and was preparing to say so. Miss Caldwell, Mia's hand tightened on the transmit key. I knew your father. Not well, briefly. But I knew him well enough to know that what I'm about to tell you would not surprise him because he was the kind of officer who expected honesty from the people above him and gave it freely to the people below him. The operations room was absolutely still. The reason Flight 317 cannot communicate with us tonight is not a malfunction originating in your aircraft. At approximately 1600 hours today, a frequency test was initiated out of Langley Air Force Base under my authorization. A classified trial of a communications suppression system. The signal radius exceeded the parameters we were given. It extended into the airspace your aircraft was transiting. Your cockpit's communication systems were disabled by us. By a decision I approved, he paused. When my analyst identified the source of the disruption and reported it to me, I classified the report and ordered it restricted. I told myself it was operational necessity. It was not. It was the decision of a man who understood the consequences of acknowledgement and chose to avoid them. Ghost would have told me the truth to my face. A silence, the kind that meant something was being set down and would not be picked up again. I owe you the same. Effective immediately, I am canceling the engagement order. Permanently, no conditions. Your aircraft is cleared to proceed to Dulles under full escort, and I will take personal and formal responsibility for everything that has happened tonight. He set the mic down. In the operations room, with the particular efficiency of trained people returning to function, keyboards began moving again. Voices relayed updated orders down the chain with the clean urgency of a situation that had changed direction and needed to be followed at speed. Webb did not look at Farrow. He did not need to. He looked at the display. 3 blips moving east, steady and together. He watched them and let himself understand for the first time since this began what he had almost done and what had stopped him, and what the difference was between those two things and what it would cost, and that the cost was correct. In the cockpit of Flight 317, Brandt had heard the general's transmission through the crack in the door. He said nothing for a full 30 seconds after it ended. Then he looked at Hollins. Get the girl. Hollins pushed the cockpit door fully open. Mia came through without being told twice. She slid into the jump seat, pulled the headset cord across to the auxiliary connection on the cockpit panel. Brandt had rigged a patch that Hollins had found in the emergency kit, a connection that allowed the auxiliary panel to route through the cockpit speakers so that what Mia heard would be audible to the crew. Improvised. Functional. The autopilot was dead. The stabilizer was losing hydraulic pressure on the right side, creating a slow, persistent drag that Brandt was compensating for with continuous left aileron input, the kind of sustained correction that used energy and attention and could not be maintained indefinitely without consequence. "Viper, this is Little Hawk," Mia said, her voice settling into the frequency without hesitation. "Now the way you settle into something practiced." "I'm in the cockpit. Patch through. Talk to me." Voss came back immediately. "Copy, Little Hawk. Your right stabilizer is losing hydraulic pressure. It's going to get worse before it stabilizes. Tell your pilots not to fight it with corrections. Compensate with a continuous left aileron lean. Small input, steady, not reactive. Think of it as a lean, not a turn. The aircraft will sort itself around it." She relayed this. Exactly. The word lean rather than turn because Voss had chosen it and he had chosen it for a reason. And the reason was that lean communicated a quality of input that turn did not, and precision in language produced precision in action. The knowledge lived in her hands now, more than her head. Years of the garage had moved it there, down from the mind into the muscle, the way any skill eventually moves when you have practiced it past the point of effort. Hollins made the adjustment. The aircraft steadied. Not perfectly. Measurably better. "Good," Voss said through the speaker, and Brandt heard it too and gave a single nod of confirmation that was not for anyone in particular, just the acknowledgement of a professional that a correct input had produced a correct result. "Viper," Mia said, "what's our approach window?" "Dulles is clear. Winds are manageable. They're giving you the long runway. You have more than enough room for manual braking with reduced stabilizer response. I wouldn't tell you that you had it if you didn't." She believed him. She did not know entirely why she believed him so completely. She had known him for less than an hour, had never met him, had only his voice through a headset, and the fact of what he had told her, and the fact that he had refused an order rather than fire on a plane carrying her. These were not small things, but they were also not a long history. She believed him because the voice carried what her father had told her to listen for, not what it said, but what it held underneath the words. Voss's voice held the specific weight of someone who had stopped being imprecise about things that mattered. It held the weight of someone paying a debt. "Copy, Viper. We're holding." Outside, the night had arrived. The sky beyond the cockpit windscreen was black, the kind of black that exists only at altitude deeper than any darkness at ground level. The navigation lights of both F-22s were visible off each wing, small, steady white and red, holding their positions with an exactness that seemed impossible, and was simply the result of two pilots doing what they had been trained to do. Mia looked at the lights off the left wing. She thought about her father in a cockpit at night. She had imagined it many times, the instruments glowing, the sense of being simultaneously very small and in control of something very large. He had tried to describe it and had said eventually that description was insufficient and she would have to experience it for herself someday. She was in a cockpit at night. She was looking at the instruments. Someday had apparently moved. 15 minutes to the outer marker, Hollins said. Brandt nodded. His hands were steady. His face was the face of a man who had decided that everything extraneous to the next 15 minutes was not currently relevant and would remain that way until the wheels were down. Mia keyed the mic. "Viper, 15 minutes out. Cockpit is ready." "Copy, Little Hawk. We'll take you in. Stay on this frequency. Don't go anywhere." She kept her hand on the panel. She did not let herself think about the envelope. She had heard something fall when Diane had pulled the emergency kit from the forward locker earlier, a soft sound too light to be equipment. She had not looked. There had been no time. She had filed it the way you file things when you are managing too many things at once. Later. Later was not now. Now was the altimeter, the heading indicator, the steady voice of Derek Voss off the left wing, the hands of Marcus Brandt on the yoke. 10 minutes, Hollins said. The runway lights of Washington Dulles appeared on the horizon. Not the runway itself, they were still too high and too far. Just the glow, the specific amber-white spread of an active airport at night, evidence of the ground waiting. Mia looked at it through the windscreen. She had watched runways appear on the horizon hundreds of times, from a passenger window forehead against the glass. She had watched the ground rise to meet the aircraft with the patient certainty of something that has been there a long time and will be there after the aircraft has long since rolled to a stop and been towed away. From here, the runway was different. From here, it was something you were making a series of decisions toward. Something you were choosing, instrument by instrument, input by input, with the understanding that every choice between here and there had a consequence, and the consequences compounded, and the compounding was the approach. Her father had known this view, every time, for years. This exact relationship between the aircraft and the runway, and the decisions required to cross the darkness between them. She understood something sitting in the jump seat of Flight 317 that she had not understood before. Not as information, she had the information. She understood it differently now. The way you understand something differently when you are inside it rather than beside it. He had done this, had sat in a seat not unlike this one, and made the choices and brought the aircraft home. And then one time he had looked across the sky and seen someone in the wrong position and made the choice that brought everyone else home instead. 5 minutes, Holland said. Gear down. The landing gear came down with a thud, solid, definite, committed. Mia keyed the mic. Viper, gears down, we're on final. Copy, Little Hawk, you're looking good from out here. Hold your heading. Let your pilots fly. She released the key. She let them fly. The runway came up fast in the way runways always do at the end. The perspective compressing the lights, spreading from a glow into individual points, into parallel lines, into something solid and real, and very close. Brant brought the nose up slightly at the last moment. The aircraft settled. The wheels touched. There was a lurch from the right side as the lagging stabilizer made itself known. One final time, and then the tires were on concrete and the thrust reversers engaged, and the world outside the windscreen became the blur of a landing roll. The aircraft slowing through a speed that felt too fast, and then through a speed that felt manageable, and then through a speed that felt like arrival. The aircraft rolled to a stop. For a moment, no one in the cockpit said anything. Then from the cabin behind them, the sound began. It built the way a wave builds from its source. One person, then three, then a row, then a section, then the whole cabin. A sound that was not applause exactly, though there was clapping in it and not crying exactly, though there was crying in it and not laughter, though there was laughter in it. It was the sound of people releasing something they had been holding for an hour without knowing how tightly they were holding it, and the release was its own kind of overwhelming. Brant put his hand over Mia's gently and took the headset from her. He pressed the transmit key himself. Viper, this is Captain Marcus Brant, Flight 317. We're down, thank you. Voss's response took a moment. Captain, take care of your passenger. Brant set the headset down. He looked at Mia. She was already shaking her head. My father did that, she said. I just used his words. Brant looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, yes, and you were the one who picked them up. She sat in 7A for a long time after the others had gone. Diane had managed the disembarkation with the same controlled efficiency she had brought to everything that evening. The passengers moved through the forward door in an orderly stream. Most of them not entirely steady on their feet, all of them changed in some way from the people who had boarded in Phoenix that afternoon. Several stopped at Mia's row on the way out. The businessman from across the aisle had stopped and looked at her and opened his mouth and then closed it and finally put his hand briefly on the headrest of her seat, the way you touch something you cannot find words for, and moved on. The mother from row 6 had stopped with both children at her sides, their small hands in hers. Thank you, sweetheart. The older child, a boy of about 7, had looked at Mia with the clear-eyed gravity of a child who knows something significant has happened and is filing it carefully away for the long work of understanding it. Mia nodded to each of them. She did not cry. Not yet. The crying was somewhere close, just on the other side of the hour, waiting with the patience of something that knows it will get its time. She looked out at the tarmac. The emergency vehicles were there, fire trucks, ambulances, a cluster of vehicles with lights turning, but their sirens were off and their personnel were standing rather than running, which was the visual language of a situation that had resolved rather than one still in progress. The 2 F-22s were visible at the far end of the tarmac, parked on the military section under the floodlights. Their engines were off, their canopies were open. They sat on the concrete with the particular stillness of machines that had been instruments of something and had now returned to being themselves. Diane came back through the empty cabin. She sat down in the aisle seat, the seat Devlin had occupied, the seat he had been in when his heart had communicated its distress in the most direct way available to it. The paramedics had taken him off the aircraft before the final approach. She had heard him as they eased him into the aisle ask about the girl on the radio. She had told him the girl was fine. He had closed his eyes and said, good. Diane sat and folded her hands in her lap. "I've been doing this for 19 years, she said. "I have a word for most things." Mia looked at her. "I don't have one for this." Then Diane reached into the pocket of her uniform jacket, slowly as if being careful was something that had been carefully kept. "This fell when I was pulling the emergency kit from above the jump seat, I think, when I moved your bag to make room for Mr. Devlin." She held it out. I didn't open it. It was an envelope. The paper had the specific quality of something stored carefully, not damaged, not deteriorated, but settled into itself the way paper settles around what it holds when it has been kept for a while. The flap was sealed. On the front in handwriting, she would have recognized anywhere in any light for "My little hawk," for "When the sky calls your name." Mia looked at it for a long moment. She took it from Diane's hand. Diane stood, put her hand briefly on Mia's shoulder, then walked forward through the empty cabin and gave her the rest of it. Mia turned the envelope over once, twice. She looked at the handwriting again. He had pressed hard with the pen. He always pressed hard, had broken the nibs of 3 different fountain pens over the course of her childhood before accepting that he was simply a person who pressed hard and buying ballpoints accordingly. The letters were dark and certain. She looked at the postmark imprint in the upper right corner. September 11th, 2019. 3 days before the training exercise. 3 days before the knock at the door. 3 days before 2 officers in crisp uniforms had stood on the porch of their house in Scottsdale, and her mother had understood what their faces meant before they said a word. He had written this 3 days before. He had sealed it. He had put it somewhere it would keep. That was enough. That was everything. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages. His handwriting the same pressed hard ballpoint, covering both pages in the density of someone who had thought carefully about what he needed to say before beginning. She read the first page without stopping. He had written about the garage, about the night she was 9 years old and the headset kept sliding off her head, and she had held it in place with both hands and still gotten every radio call correct on the 3rd try. He had written, "I didn't tell you that night, but I wanted to. You had it from the beginning. Not the technique comes with time. The ear. The willingness to stay with the frequency until something comes back." She turned the page. The second page was shorter. He had written about what he was leaving. Her "not the jacket," though he mentioned it, mentioned the reason he had asked her mother to sew the name inside, and "not the call sign," though he mentioned that too. What he was leaving her, he wrote, was simpler and harder to describe than either of those things. He called it the habit of answering. Most people, when the situation gets hard, go quiet. They wait for someone else to pick up the frequency. They tell themselves they're not qualified, not trained, not the right person. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the right person is just whoever decides to answer. "I have watched you your whole life. I know which kind you are." She stopped at the bottom of the page. His handwriting pressed hard into the paper, certain in the way he had always been certain about the things that mattered. "If the sky ever calls your name, little hawk, answer it. I already know you will." She folded the letter. She held it in both hands. Outside the oval window, the tarmac lights were amber and steady, and the two F-22s were at the far end of the field, and the emergency lights were turning in silence, and the world was continuing its business around her, the way the world does, indifferent and reliable and ongoing. She had answered. The sky had called, and she had picked up the frequency and stayed on it until something came back. She sat with that for a while. Then she stood up. The night air outside was warm, softer than Phoenix in September, carrying the particular combination of jet fuel and cut grass that airports carry at night when the big flights have landed and the ground equipment runs on low cycles. She came down the air stairs. At the bottom, 2 figures in flight suits were waiting. Voss was taller than she had imagined from his voice. He was broad-shouldered, his flight suit creased from hours in the cockpit, his helmet under one arm. His face was the face of a man in his early 40s who had spent a significant portion of those years looking at something difficult and had not looked away from it. Dunn stood beside him, slightly to the left, her own helmet tucked under her arm. She was younger, carrying the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having learned to hold a great deal of motion in a very contained space. Mia understood, looking at her, that this was what it looked like to have watched someone fall out of the sky and then gone on flying anyway. Mia stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Voss went down on one knee. It was not a dramatic gesture, simply the action of a large man who wanted to be at eye level with someone smaller and who had decided this was worth doing. He looked at her. "Your father saved my life," he said. "Tonight you saved 180. That math is not a coincidence. That is who he raised. Mia looked back at him. She thought about the letter, the second paragraph of the second page, the habit of answering. He always said the radio is just a voice, she said, and a voice is just a person. She paused. Tonight, I finally understood what he meant. Voss nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone receiving something they have been waiting a long time to receive. He stood. Dunn stepped forward. She held out her hand. On her open palm was a small metal pin, a wing insignia, silver worn at the edges, in the way things are worn when they have been handled, often taken out and held, and put back too many times to count. Below the wings, a small designation marker. His unit, his rank, the identifier that had been specific to one pilot in one cockpit over a career of years. Ghost's insignia. He gave it to me the day before the accident, Dunn said. Her voice was level with the effort of someone who has had 2 years to prepare a sentence and still finds that preparation insufficient. I don't know why. He handed it to me on the tarmac after our last briefing together and said, keep it. I kept it. I've been carrying it for 2 years, not knowing what I was supposed to do with it. A pause. I think I was carrying it for you. Mia looked at the insignia for a long moment. She reached out and took it. It was lighter than she expected. Or perhaps she had expected it to be very heavy-weighted by everything it represented. The lightness of it was its own kind of information. It was a small thing, real and specific and entirely itself. She closed her fingers around it. She looked up at the 2 F-22s at the far end of the tarmac under the floodlights, their canopies still open, their lines clean against the night sky. Voss followed her gaze. Then, without a word, without a signal, she could see both aircraft moved. Not mechanically. The ground crew had not touched them. The engines had not restarted. What moved was the left wing of each aircraft tilting slowly downward in unison 1 degree, 2 degrees, then returning to level. The motion in the floodlight was slow and deliberate and entirely visible from where they stood. Not protocol, not procedure. Recognition. Mia watched the wings return to level. She held her father's insignia in her closed hand, and she stood in the warm September night of Washington Dulles, and she breathed in and breathed out. Then she looked up. Not at the aircraft, not at the floodlights or the turning emergency lights or the amber spread of the airport around her. She looked past all of it at the place where the light ended and the dark began, and the stars were doing what they always did, present steady, entirely indifferent to the specifics of what had happened beneath them this evening, and present for it anyway. She said it quietly, just enough for it to be real. Dad, I flew today. Nothing answered. The night was large and still and full of the normal sounds of a large airport settling into its late evening rhythms. A departing aircraft on the far runway, a fuel truck idling somewhere to the left. Voices of ground crew in conversation too far away to be specific. She did not need an answer. The letter was in her hand. He had already given her one. 6 weeks after the events of September 14th, 2021, General Harlan Webb submitted a formal letter of resignation to the Secretary of the Air Force. He cited personal responsibility for the Langley frequency testing incident and its consequences. He was the only senior officer to face formal review. The review concluded the following spring. Specialist Bridget Farrow's incident report, written on the night of September 14th, time-stamped and preserved in its original form, was declassified in the spring of 2024. It became part of the documentary record of the event. It matched General Webb's own account exactly. Air Marshal Russ Devlin was released from George Washington University Hospital 4 days after landing. He returned to active duty in February 2022. Major Derek Voss and Captain Petra Dunn received formal commendations for their conduct during the intercept. The citation noted their decision to maintain escort and establish communication, rather than execute engagement protocols. Neither pilot was disciplined for the order they refused. Mia Caldwell turned 15 the following November. On her 16th birthday, she passed her student pilot examination at a small airfield outside Scottsdale, Arizona. The examiner noted that her radio procedure was the most precise he had encountered in a student pilot in 20 years of administering the test. He asked her where she had learned. She said, "My father taught me." She wore his jacket to the examination. She is 17 years old now. The student pilot license is on the wall above her desk, next to a silver wing insignia that shows the wear of having been handled often by someone who needed to hold on to something real. Beside both of them in a simple frame, the last 4 words of a letter written on September 11th, 2019, pressed hard into the paper. Certain in the way the important things are certain by a man who knew which kind of person his daughter was before she knew it herself. The frame is small. The words are not,